Dear friends, thank you for joining us for this second day of this workshop. Uh, sorry, the third lecture in the series. Today I'm going to talk about validity, Bayes theorem, and bias. So, a lot of different kind of topics today. I'll talk about validity, sensitivity, specificity, predictive values. What is diagnostic odds ratio? P-values in diagnostic studies. Little about Bayesian philosophy, indeterminate, intermediate, and uninterpretable results, bias in diagnostic study, including spectrum and verification bias. So I'll get started. Before I start, I must acknowledge that I have taken material from the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine, Oxford, Cochrane Diagnostic Methods, a lot of articles from the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology. Many of my teachers, Dr. J. Seelan, Dr. Muriel, Dr. Abraham Pinike, who are all my teachers here, Dr. Pratap, and I gratefully acknowledge all these sources. Let's start with a recap of a diagnostic study. We have a group of patients with suspected disease. Everybody has a new test. Everybody in the same group has also a gold standard or a reference standard test. The reference standard classifies people as having disease, and this group is called no disease. The index test also calls people diseased and no diseased. People whom the reference standard and the index test agree are called true positive. People whom the reference standard and the index test call negative are true negative. People whom the reference standard calls negative, but the new test calls positive or false positive. Whereas people whom the index test says are negative, but actually the reference standard says positive, are called false negative by the index test. To recap, reliability and validity are both measures of test performance, but they have different meanings. Reliability is the extent to which measurements of a relatively stable phenomenon fall close to each other. Reproducibility, precision are other words used for reliability. For example, two psychiatrists use two instruments, two investigators. None of them is a gold standard, but we just want to know how closely the two are related to each other or reproducible. Validity, on the other hand, is the degree to which results of a measurement correspond to a true state of the phenomenon being measured. Some people call it accuracy. The true state is measured by a gold standard test, which could be a biopsy, a culture, MRI, or even a prospective follow-up. So that is validity. So validity is a degree to which the data, the measure what we are intended to measure, the accuracy. How accurate is it when compared to a true measure? The true measure is also called the criterion standard or the gold standard or the reference standard. Validity is also the ability of a test to classify subjects as diseased and non-diseased. Now, some may not agree with the concept of diseased or non-diseased, but often we do that. We dichotomize people like that. While doing this, classifying people as diseased and non-diseased, two measures come. I'll talk about these measures again and again. Sensitivity is the proportion of subjects with disease who are test positive. Specificity is the proportion of subjects without the disease who have a negative test. When I show the 2 by 2 table, that will become more clear. So why do we need sensitivity and specificity? So we need a diagnostic test to be both highly sensitive as well as specific. That's an important point. But this is unfortunately not always possible. When you increase sensitivity, usually specificity comes down. And if you increase specificity, sensitivity comes down. Now, different testing strategies have different requirements. Some tests require high sensitivity, whereas other tests require high specificity. So highly sensitive tests are required, are rarely negative in the presence of disease. Early stages of a diagnostic workup is where we use highly sensitive tests. And if you suspect a dangerous disease, for example, HIV ELISA is highly sensitive, so it's rarely negative in the presence of disease. A highly specific test is rarely positive in the absence of disease. That would be the next test in HIV, would be like a Western blot test. So confirming a diagnosis that is suggested by clinical tests, clinical data or other tests. So once a HIV ELISA is positive, then we do a specific test, a Western blot test to confirm this. Now I would like you all to look at this slide for a second. Here we have the study sample or the patients who are undergoing the test. The index test is a new test, which could be positive or it could be negative. All the patients then undergo the reference standard, which could be positive or negative. And again, we come to true positive, false positive. If the index test is negative, we have a reference standard, which if it's positive, then we say false negative, and we have true negative. Based on these 4 data squares, we estimate accuracy of a test as well as sensitivity and specificity. Now we are going to go into sensitivity and specificity to make it more clear. All of you will understand if I recap now. If both tests are positive, it's true positive. If both are negative, we say true negative. If the gold standard is positive, whereas a new test is negative, we say false negative. If the gold standard is negative, but the test is positive, we say it's a false positive. Sensitivity. The proportion of people with disease who are test positive. With disease is always referred to by the gold standard, so that is the arrow down here. With disease is, if you label the squares A, B, C, and D, with disease is A plus C. Among A plus C, the test positive is A. So for example, if the numbers in the square are 90 and 10, A will be 90, A plus C is 100. So the sensitivity in this particular example would be 90%. Specificity is the proportion of people without disease who have a negative test result. Without disease, other people by gold standard are these squares B and D. So B plus D don't have disease. Among them, the test came negative in D. So D upon B plus D is specificity. If D is 75 and B was 25 in an example, B plus D is 100. So 75 divided by 100 is the specificity, or 75%. So here's an example. There were 61 children with influenza. A rapid test was positive in 27 of them. So there were 61 people positive by the gold standard. 27 were picked up by the rapid test. Let's say the gold standard was a PCR and the rapid test was an ELISA. So the sensitivity of the new test is 27 divided by the whole number 61, which is 44%. The specificity is this column here, which is the negative by the gold standard. There were 96 children who did not have influenza by the PCR gold standard. 93 of them were called negative by the rapid ELISA test. Therefore, the specificity is 93 divided by 96, which comes to 0.97 or 97%. Now, I hope that is clear, because that is often the bedrock test which is often produced. Next, we are going to move on to positive and negative predictive value. Now, the new test positivity goes along the horizontal axis. The new test is positive, includes the true positive as well as the false positive. That is A plus B. Among that, only A is a true positive. So the proportion of people with a positive test who have disease is A, positive test is A plus B, so the proportion is A by A plus B. That is called positive predictive value or PPV. Who were negative? C plus D by the new test. Among that, D were the only ones who were truly negative. So the proportion of people with a negative test, that is C plus D, who do not have disease, that is D. So D by C plus D is called negative predictive value. If we use the example that we used earlier for the influenza study, the people who are positive by the new test by the ELISA are 30. Among that, 27 really have disease. So 27 out of 30 is the positive predictive value of the test. The new test was negative in 127. Among that, 93 were truly negative. So the negative predictive value of the new test is 93 divided by 127, which is 73%. So you can see here that the 3 here and 34 are the false results. Now I'm going to move on. I hope that these have been clear to you. All right. I had some questions. Okay. Now I'm going to move on to a slightly different type of validity. I want to emphasize that these face validity, content validity, criterion validity, and construct validity, these relate to qualitative research. Remember the first day when I talked about study designs, I talked about qualitative study. And on COVID, we talked about the problems that nurses faced. They had positive emotions, negative emotions, they built up character, stuff like that. So it put a questionnaire. How do you develop a questionnaire? How do you know the questionnaire is asking what it's supposed to ask? So just remember that these types of validity relate to qualitative research, and I'm going to take you through the next 4 types. So this is a slight variation of validity. Face validity. So whether your questionnaire is good or bad, a group of experts look at it and they decide whether the questionnaire measures what its name suggests. So evaluating face validity, it's a subjective process. So the expert says, yes, your questionnaire will measure what it's supposed to. So just on the face of it, it looks good to me. So it's a least statistical estimate. So you can look at the agreement among experts. How many experts? 5 out of 6 experts said that this questionnaire is measuring what it's supposed to measure. That is face validity. The higher the percentage of experts who says it measures what it's supposed to measure, higher the face validity. So this is the first step any questionnaire has to face. And often it may be your guide or your senior in your department. If they say that this is not a useful questionnaire you have developed, that may be the end of your questionnaire. Face validity. Content validity. This is like the next step. It is the extent to which questions probe various aspects of the areas it is supposed to measure. A questionnaire should cover representative collection of items and used in a sensible manner. So it relies on reasoning of the listener and also the past experience of the expert. For example, a questionnaire that measures participation in regular exercise. So the questionnaire is asking how often you exercise. It should encompass all common forms of exercise. 1. It should include space for the respondents to add any other exercise not listed. You may say skipping, running, jumping, but he may want to add swimming or something else or aerobics. So you must keep some blank space for that. So you must consult with agencies, like such example, the Department of Sports, and give the questionnaire to them as well as some of the respondents to see whether the questionnaire works well. This is called content validity. So for example, a questionnaire on depressed patients must include low mood, loss of interest, difficulty in sleeping, decreased appetite or increased appetite. So the instruments for depression must have something about each of these. And it must have a holistic approach to all these in its construct. So that's content validity. So we talked about face validity, content validity. The third is called criterion validity. How a new measure relates to other measures or diagnosis. Here you have to have some sort of a gold standard question. And in that you see how the other questions fare up to that particular gold standard question. So the relationship between your new question and the criterion or the gold standard question is expressed as a validity coefficient. So it indicates the extent to which the test is valid for making a statement about that criterion or that gold standard. Validity coefficients can range between 0.3 and 0.4 is low. Validity coefficients more than 0.6 are good. Less than 0.3 very low, bad. More than 0.6 very good. So there's a validity coefficient for a questionnaire. So let us say that you do an interview and you have some questionnaire in the interview and you want to see how that question predicts whether the employee finally does his job. So at the end of it, you can see the correlation is the gold standard is how he did his job. And the question and the questionnaire was the thing you're testing. So you can check the criterion validity of that question in the questionnaire. Whether that performance test correlates with how the employee finally did his job. Suppose you like the NEET questions. Oh, these are the so many important questions, let's say in chemistry or physics. How does it predict how well a student will perform in MBBS? So the performance or the test, the NEET, how does it predict the estimator variable? Sorry, let me just rephrase that. The performance in the test for this interview or your NEET score, that is called a predictor or an estimator variable. So criterion validity, there will be two variables. One is the predictor, that is the NEET score or your performance. How well the chap finally did his job or her job. How well the person who got it for MBBS did in MBBS. That is called criterion variable. So you have a predictor variable or estimator variable and a criterion variable. Now, this is in a diagnostic study, in a qualitative study. In a quantitative type of gold standard study, let us say the gold standard is echocardiography. Sorry, the new test is the echocardiography. That will also be called the predictor variable. The criterion variable or the gold standard is a post-mortem examination of the person's heart. Left ventricular hypertrophy means the left side of heart became big. So the echo is the predictor variable. The post-mortem examination becomes the criterion variable. Another example, ECG as an evidence of ischemic heart disease. That will be the predictor variable. The gold standard will be coronary angiography. Now, if you do a qualitative study, it's relatively easy to find a gold standard. But in social sciences like generally we say about qualitative research, finding one gold standard is often problematic. But people do it, and this is called criterion validity. The last type of validity which we talk about in patients in qualitative research is called construct validity. So you must have some general idea about how a social story is made up of. When I give the example in the next slide, it will become clear to you. But if you're not very clear about the concepts about what you're doing, let's say depression, What are the different aspects of depression? Then that's called a poor construct. It lacks theoretical agreement on the content. The content could be depression. So then the questions which you make or the indicators which you think are measuring one thing, what one researcher understands will be quite different from another researcher's understanding of the same thing. So this is also called factorial validity. Good constructs, on the other hand, have clear definitions and there are measurable indicators. So I know that this may sound confusing to you, but just remember that construct validity talks about a construct, about a situation. You must understand all a sort of the overall story of what you're trying to tell. The next slide will make it clear. Let us say you're talking about stigma. Remember, this is a qualitative study of stigma and HIV/AIDS. So before the study, you think that, oh, there is something called negative stigma. Then there's something called negative stigma that, oh, I feel bad, I got HIV. Disclosure stigma means, oh, I now have to go and tell somebody, how am I going to tell my family I've got HIV? Public attitude, what will people think about me? The next is self-stigma. I feel bad about myself. What kind of a human being am I? And I managed to go and get HIV. So this is a construct that you created before you did the study. These are the aspects of stigma. So now you will explore each of these. Okay, remember these four stigmas: self, negative, public, and disclosure. In self-stigma, you will think, but let me ask some questions about employment. I feel rejected. I am discriminated against. Negative stigma is your fear people may stigmatize me. People may look at me in a strange way. Individuals may look at me and say I'm guilty. They may believe I'm a bad man. So if you have these kind of, so you start off with the construct. This is the construct I told you about. And this is where a negative, a bad construct is you don't really understand the situation properly and you leave out, let's say you leave out self-stigma. Then you will not think about loss of employment, rejection, or discrimination. So finally, when you make a questionnaire, these are the questionnaire which one made. So for self-stigma, they said, since leaving, I have HIV. Since learning I have HIV, I felt set apart and isolated. Most people with HIV are rejected when others find out. Some people who know I have HIV have grown distant. I have been hurt by how people reacted. I regret having told some people I have HIV. So this is what the questionnaire found out from the patients. But imagine if you had forgotten that there was an idea called self-stigma or personalized stigma, then you would have missed out all of these. For negative, for negative stigma, similarly, there are some set of questions. I feel guilty. People's attitude makes me feel worse. I have to work hard to keep it a secret. I feel I'm not a good person because I have HIV. HIV makes me feel unclean. These are negative emotions about one's own self. So you see how that the correct construct, sorry, I'm jumping back. Poor construct means you left out some of those ideas, whereas a good construct left clear definitions. This is also called factorial validity or construct validity. Now, obviously, when you're planning a questionnaire, if you're going to look at the validity, it is good to have a social scientist involved in this, and they will help you to make this questionnaire properly valid. Now, that's all I'm going to talk about validity. And I must acknowledge one person I have not talked about when talking about all this validity is one of my teachers, Dr. Shubha Kumar. She runs an NGO for social sciences called Samarth. So if anybody is interested in learning more about social science research, we can ask Dr. J. Siran can probably arrange some classes for you all on qualitative research with Dr. Shubha Kumar. So I know that today there are different kinds of topics. So we have finished talking about validity. Next, I'm going to move on to something called diagnostic odds. So I'm going to add on to what I've taught so far. So diagnostic odds, according to Glass, a famous researcher, the diagnostic odds ratio is a single indicator of a test performance. Let's recap now. Sensitivity of a test. True positive divided by true positive plus false negative. So it's the vertical axis of a 2 by 2 table. Specificity is the next column in a 2 by 2 table. True negative divided by true negative plus false positive, or the proportion of negative test results among healthy. Positive predictive values along the horizontal, the proportion of among subjects with positive test result. Negative predictive value is the proportion of non-diseased among subjects with a negative test result. So this is the sensitivity and specificity. Now, we will talk about some new concepts now. Likelihood ratio. Now, mathematically, it's very easy. Sensitivity divided by 1 minus specificity is a likelihood ratio of a positive test. Sensitivity divided by 1 minus specificity is a ratio of a positive test result among diseased to the same result among healthy. So healthy in the bottom, diseased on top. The likelihood ratio of a negative test. Mathematically, see, sensitivity is always on top, specific below. But here you see the 1 minus specific denominator. Here I say 1 minus sensitivity divided by specificity. That is the likelihood ratio of a negative test. Or in simple English, the ratio of a negative test result among diseased to the same result in the healthy. Now, accuracy. Accuracy is the true positive plus the true negative divided by all the 4 squares put together. So the upper A square and the D square together are the true positive plus true negative. The denominator is A plus B plus C plus D. So this is the proportion of correctly identified subjects. This is called accuracy. I'm also going to talk a little bit later about Uden's index, which is sensitivity plus specificity minus 1. I will come back to this. Now you may say, oh, all sorts of this diagnostic test is becoming increasingly complex. So many ways of expressing it. It is true, it is complex. So a study was done looking at ovarian cancer, and they did 3 diagnostic tests: ultrasound, CT scan, MRI scan. And for each of these, they have reported sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive value, negative predictive value, likelihood ratio positive, likelihood ratio minus negative test, and a new test, diagnostic odds ratio. The next 10-15 minutes, I'm going to talk only about these. So don't get worried about these. We'll talk about each in detail. First, let's look at sensitivity and specificity. You see, ultrasound has a sensitivity of 69%. A sensitivity of 100% will be very good. But specificity is very good, 93. So you're very happy. Oh, the specificity is good. But look at the CT scan. Sensitivity 92%, but the specificity is 81%. So MRI also high sensitivity, but lower specificity. Remember, I told you you need a test which is both sensitive and specific. This has a particular problem. The sensitivity of the ultrasound is worse than CT, but for specificity, it is reverse. Now, positive predictive value for ultrasound is only 78%, whereas negative predictive value is 90%. Similarly, for CT scan, 61 and 97. So there is no test, it seems here. It's got high sensitivity, specificity, high positive predictive value, high negative predictive value. They don't seem to be slightly problematic. When one is high, the other becomes low. Likelihood ratio, I'm going to talk about that in a little while. But just remember, when I come back to this, I'll talk about this. Likelihood ratios positive, closer to 10 or above 10 are very good. Likelihood ratio negative, closer to 0.1 are very good. So it's like here is 10 is very good, but 0.3 is not so good. Here 0.1 negative likelihood ratio very good, but 5.1 not so good. Here 0 is fantastic, maybe 0.01 or something, whereas 4.8 is not so good. So how do you compare these various tests? So likelihood ratios and predictive values are also not decisive. So that's what I just showed you, that all these numbers also are not helping us to sum up the whole test in one. So combined evidence of pairs of indicators cannot simply be ranked. So we can't just do average of sensitivity plus specificity, average of likelihood ratio. That's also not very useful. Remember, the accuracy is the percentage of people who are correctly classified. That is square A and square D, or true positive plus true negative. This accuracy depends on the prevalence of the target disorder in the study group. When it's highly prevalent all over, more than 50% of people actually have disease, accuracy may look good. So the problem with accuracy is the squares which are on the other diagonal, false negative and false positive, accuracy tends to equate them equally. Now, for a particular patient, a false positive report may be much worse than false negative. Imagine a HIV test being falsely positive. Whereas for cancer, false negative may be very high. If you wrongly tell somebody you don't have cancer, they go home very happily, then they may come back with advanced cancer after some time. So the problem with accuracy, it equates both the false positive and false negative. It gives them equal weightage. Now this chap Uden, not a chap, he's a famous scientist Uden, he came up with an idea. Let us do sensitivity and specificity combination. So it's a transformation. So Uden's index is also represented as small j, and j is the sensitivity plus specificity minus 1. Now, imagine the sensitivity to be 1 or 100%, specificity to be 1 or 100%. So 1 plus 1 is 2, 2 minus 1 is 1. So if the j or the Uden's index is 1, that's very good. It's a perfect test. No false positive, no false negative. On the other hand, values less than 1 are progressively worse and worse, and a value of Uden index 0 means the test is useless. So this is one test which people commonly report in diagnostic studies. But I'm going to move on to the test which some people now use, diagnostic odds ratio. Now you're all stats people, and you know that odds ratio is an AD by BC. That's exactly what is given here. You know the 4 squares, true positive, false negative, false positive, false negative. So AD by BC, or sensitivity divided by 1 minus sensitivity divided by 1 minus specificity by specificity. So diagnostic odds ratio can be talked of in 2 different ways. It is the ratio of odds of positivity in disease relative to the odds of positivity in non-disease. So this is what this formula comes up with. Diagnostic odds ratio could also be set off as the ratio of odds of disease in test positive relative to the odds of disease in test negative. Here is disease positive first, and here it is the test. But ultimately, the formula works out to the same. Now, many people say that, oh, okay, diagnostic odds ratio is a very useful one because it combines sensitivity and specificity. Now, what about this likelihood ratio? There is a close relationship between the diagnostic odds ratio and likelihood ratio. Diagnostic odds ratio is calculated as the positive likelihood ratio divided by the negative likelihood ratio. How do you interpret this diagnostic odds ratio? The diagnostic odds ratio can range between 0 to infinity. Higher values have better discrimination between diseased and non-diseased. Remember, it can be 0 to infinity. A diagnostic odds ratio of 1, as you all know, odds ratio of 1 is no use. The test does not discriminate people with and without disease. Can you have values less than 1? It's an improper test interpretation. There's something wrong with the test interpretation. There are more negative tests among the disease. So that's a little problem. You must check your coding. Probably there may be some coding error if you find a diagnostic odds ratio less than 1. However, there's something called an inverse diagnostic odds ratio, which some people publish. That is the ratio of negativity odds within the diseased relative to the odds of negativity within the non-diseased. So this is a negative or inverse of odds ratio. So how does this diagnostic odds ratio relate to sensitivity and specificity? Now I'll just tell you sensitivity first and diagnostic odds ratio. Remember, diagnostic odds ratio could be 1 to infinity. So the higher up on the curve, it's better. And here sensitivity. Generally, you see that as the sensitivity goes up, diagnostic odds ratio also goes up. That's very good. How do you represent specificity on this? Each of these lines represents a different specificity set. So, for example, this dot and dash is 0.99 specificity. The big bold is 0.95 and this line is 0.8 and the dot 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 is a specificity of 0.5. That will be 0.5. This will be 0.95. So as you can see that as the sensitivity increases, always the diagnostic odds also seem to increase. There is some sort of inflection point, but it also depends on the specificity pair along with it. So this is how the relationship between diagnostic odds ratio, sensitivity and specificity. So let's have a look. Remember I told you that we are comparing 3 tests, ultrasound, CT and MRI for people with ovarian cancer which has spread in the abdomen or peritoneal metastasis. Clearly you can see the MRI has got the best diagnostic odds ratio. But ultrasound has got 31. What does this 31 mean? The odds of positivity among subjects with peritoneal metastasis is 31 times higher than the odds of positivity among subjects without peritoneal metastasis. That's what a diagnostic odds ratio is mentioned as. So we are not talking about one study design called systematic review and meta-analysis. But when you want to combine many diagnostic studies, some people just report the overall sensitivities and specificities of each study. Or we can take the diagnostic odds ratio and use it in a meta-analysis. It can also be used in logistic regression for decision rules. So is it a fantastic test? No, there are some issues and one must be careful about diagnostic odds ratios. In clinical applications, it is unlikely to depend on the spectrum of disease that was used to develop. It is likely to depend on the spectrum of disease. So just remember that every test varies depending on where it is done. The PICO statement, if you remember in lecture 1, the patient, the new test, the comparative test, all these vary from place to place. So if you have more severe disease patients in one place, diagnostic odds ratio also will look relatively good. As a global measure, let us say we compare 31 in the previous test with 50 and 70, it cannot be used to judge a test error rate. Just remember that the errors, the false positive and the false negative, cannot be assumed looking at the diagnostic odds ratio. Why? Two tests with identical diagnostic odds ratio can have very different sensitivity and specificity with different clinical consequences. Now you know that if a 2 by 2 table has a 0, how will you do the AD by BC or the odds ratio calculation? Now you're all stats people, so you clearly will say yes, add 0.5 to all the counts of the table. And this is correct. This is often used as a measurement, as a workaround for having a 0 in a diagnostic table. The fourth issue is, suppose a false positive and false negative mean different things. Like I told you, a false positive HIV test is terrible for somebody. A false negative cancer diagnosis for somebody is also equally terrible. So both may not be given equal weightage. So both the prevalence and the conditional error rates of the test have to be taken into consideration to make a balanced decision. In these conditions, where the false positive and false negative are weighted differently, diagnostic odds ratio may not be that useful. All right. So, like I said, many of the topics which I'm covering today are married to each other, and I'll repeat the topic points on and off, so that you can see the thread, common thread that this whole lecture has got. Now we are going to talk about Bayesian methods in diagnosis. What is Bayesian methods? Once again, forgive me if I'm teaching the experts, but I'm assuming that this is new to some of you. So Bayesian is marrying your prior knowledge. What do you know before you did the test? The prevalence of the disease, clinical intuition. It's also called pre-test probability. Pre-test probability. You marry that with something from the current test. A combination of sensitivity and specificity I told you is likelihood ratio. And you come to a new posterior view of the test or probability. So this is an important concept. So generally, how do people use sensitivity and specificity? Remember the mnemonic spin and snout. Spin and snout. You can remember spin, somebody bowling cricket. Snout is the snout of a pig. Okay, spin and snout. Highly sensitive test. I think I made a mistake here. Highly specific test. Sorry, I apologize. A highly specific test, if positive, you can rule in disease. Specific test is positive, rule in. Highly specific, rule out. And snout, a highly sensitive test. If negative, you can rule out disease. So I apologize for that. So this is how generally one uses these tests in medicine. It's not intuitive. People think sensitivity is disease positive. Highly sensitive, I can rule in disease. No, a highly sensitive test, if negative, can rule out disease. A highly specific test, if positive, can rule in disease. I'm going to spend some more time on likelihood ratio. The probability of finding a clinical finding or a test positive in people with disease, the probability of finding the same finding in people without disease. This is called likelihood ratio. So there are two likelihood ratios. I've already told you about them, but I'm just going to go in more detail now. A positive likelihood ratio and a negative likelihood ratio. Positive likelihood ratio is how much more likely is a positive test to be found in a person with disease than in a person without it. How much more positive is a positive test in a person with disease? That is the sensitivity. Than in a person without disease. That's a false positivity. The specificity, 1 minus specificity is the square just on top of it, or the false positivity. The sensitivity by false positivity is a positive likelihood ratio. Negative likelihood ratio. How much more likely is a negative test to be found in a person without disease than in a person with disease? And the person with disease is a specificity, the true negative. 1 minus sensitivity is a false negativity. The false negative rate by specificity is a negative likelihood ratio. How does one interpret these negative and positive likelihood ratio? Likelihood ratio, in a sense, is interpreted somewhat like an odds ratio or relative risk. A likelihood ratio of 1, you can think of it as an odds ratio in a sense. A likelihood ratio of 1 means the test has no diagnostic value. That means that test will not help you distinguish this disease than non-disease. A likelihood ratio of more than 10 is a very strongly positive result, and it suggests that the person probably has a disease you're testing for. A negative likelihood ratio closer to 0.1 is a very strong negative test, and it suggests the person on whom you did the test has a very, very low probability of having disease. So at the end of the test, you want to know what is the post-test probability of having disease. Likelihood ratios will help you to look at that. Okay, I'm just going to take a 1 second break to drink some water. Okay. Now, I'm going to show you how this is used in real life. If a patient comes to you with a particular illness, let us say one of your children suddenly has pain just above the below the belly button, or umbilicus, you have pain, and you go to the doctor, and you're not gone to the doctor, and you're thinking in my mind, what's the chance my child has appendicitis? So you think, oh, maybe 5% chance. That chance before you saw the doctor is called pre-test probability. The pre-test probability could be 1, 0, or 100%. As you know with probabilities, it's called the pre-test probability. 5% came from the parent's guess. Now there is a new, it's a real test called speed bump test. It sounds like a fictitious test, but it's really not. If you're driving in a motorbike or car and you go over a speed bump and you have pain below your umbilicus, and that's called a speed bump test, which is positive. That suggests appendicitis. Now the patient has a pre-test probability of 5%. You're driving your child to hospital. The speed bump test came positive. Now the speed bump test has a negative likelihood ratio of 0.1. That means when the test is negative, the likelihood ratio is 0.1. The pre-test probability is 5%. The negative likelihood ratio is 0.1. If you join these two lines, this middle line is called likelihood ratio line. This line here at the end is called post-test probability. If you join these two lines, it ends up at 0.5. So before doing the speed bump test, you said my child has 5% chance of having appendicitis. The speed bump test was negative. After that, the post-test probability is 0.5%. Then you may tell your spouse, oh, my child probably doesn't have appendicitis, let's go home. Why he'll ask or she will ask, you say speed bump test was negative. The post-test probability of appendicitis is so low, I think we might as well go home. On the other hand, you go to the hospital and the doctor presses your child's stomach or belly and there's pain in the abdomen. That's called McBurney's tenderness. When the doctor presses the abdomen, there's pain. That particular sensation of pain has a likelihood ratio of 3.4. Remember, the pre-test probability still remains 5%. But here the test is positive. The previous speed bump test was negative. Here it's positive. The likelihood ratio is 3.4. So you join the pre-test probability with the likelihood ratio of 3.4. And that line ends in the post-test probability of close to 20%. So now you will say that, oh, the child has 20% chance of appendicitis. Now you will tell the doctor, doctor, you just put your hand, why don't you do ultrasound or CT scan and confirm? Doctor may say, no need, I'm going to operate straight away. That's your choice. But this is how the pre-test probability marries with the likelihood ratio, which is a combination of sensitivity and specificity. Remember, negative likelihood ratio and positive likelihood ratio. They combine to end up with a post-test probability. Mathematically, the pre-test odds, this is probability, remember. You can convert it to probability, odds, sorry. 5% pre-test probability will become 5 out of 95 pre-test odds. So you multiply the pre-test odds into the likelihood ratio, you will get a post-test odds. The post-test odds can be converted back into a probability. Fagan sat and made this millions of times and finally came up with a chart which is used worldwide so that you can avoid doing all the mathematics. Now let's do some, work. HIV test is used to screen 1,000 patients for chronic HIV, for chronic HIV. The sensitivity of the test is 100%, specificity is 99%. The population prevalence is 1%. India's prevalence is 0.3 or even less. Let us say it is some country somewhere, sub-Saharan Africa, where the population prevalence is 1%. Of all the patients who are tested positive, how many are truly infected with the virus? So I'm going to give you all 30 seconds to work on this particular problem, and I want you to give me an answer. Or we don't have time to look at the answer, but I would like you all to try and work out the answer. A HIV test is used to screen. Okay. Sensitivity 100%, specificity is 99%. 1% of the population have HIV. So I want you all to actually do this physically and write down in your own answer on your mind, what is the chance a person actually has HIV? Well, we'll give you all 30 seconds to see this. Okay, I'll move on. So questions later. Okay. Now you have 1,000 people. 1% have disease, that is 10. That means 990 don't have disease. We got this number from the prevalence, 1%. Among the 10 who have disease, the sensitivity of the test is 100%. That means it picked up all 10. There is true positive. There is no false negative. Interestingly, among the 990, remember the specificity is 99%. So among the 990, 99% is 980, the true negative. That leaves 10% who are false positive. Given 1% prevalence, 10 have HIV, 990 do not. All 10 patients will have a positive result. Sensitivity of 100%. Of the 990 who have HIV, 980 will test negative. 10 patients will have false positive. So if you look at the previous slide, overall, true positive is 10, false positive is 10. So you don't know that. You just know the test is positive. So the test will be positive in 20 people out of 1,000. That includes true positive and false positive. So you find that among the 20 people who are tested positive, only 10 are truly positive. Remember that? Out of the 20 who are tested positive, only 10 are truly positive. That comes to 50%. Therefore, any patient in this population who tests positive has a 50% probability of having HIV. In this scenario, 50% positive results are due to chance. So just be careful. Do a population screening, blood bank screening, and then somebody comes positive. Maybe only 50% chance he actually has HIV. So that's something important to consider. Now the same thing. You go to a commercial sex worker or a brothel or area where there are a lot of commercial sex workers. And in that population you test. And you think to your mind, okay, people are not using safe sex when they go to a commercial sex worker. So let's say 50% of those commercial sex workers may have HIV. It's probably much less, but I'm just saying for an example. Now the test is positive. How much do you think is the true positivity in this particular situation? Now, I really would love for all of you to work out this sum, but in the interest of time, I'm going to walk you all through this. Let me see how much time I have. It's 5:30. I have about 30 slides left. Okay, I'll give you all 20 seconds to try and work it out on a piece of paper and write it down. So just remember that here in this situation, 50% are positive. So 500 out of 1000 will have disease, 500 won't have disease. Because it's a 100% sensitive test, all 500 will be picked up as positive. Among the 500 negative, it is 99% specific. So that 495 will be negative. But 1% are going to be false positive. That's 5. So now you see a slightly different situation. We just know the test is positive. So 500 plus 5, 505 are test positive, among whom 500 truly have the disease. So then you find now the answer is 99% chance post-test probability of truly having disease. So I have explained to you using the Fagan's nomogram. I have told you the likelihood ratio method of using the calculating the post-test probability. And this is another easy method of finding out the post-test probability. Given and I've also showed you the example of how it's so important to know the prior probability of disease. Just remember that when the prior probability of disease was 1%, the true chance of having disease is only 50%. If you're positive for a disease like HIV, with a superb sensitivity of 100% and a sensitivity 100 and specificity 99%. Very, very few tests have that. At the same time, the prevalence goes up to 50%, then the chance of having disease goes up to 99% if your test is positive. This is the effect of prevalence, sensitivity, specificity. Now we are going to move on to another area, p-value. So the performance of a study in testing a hypothesis can be described as using power and p-value. So you're all familiar with power and p-value. So I'm going to talk about a sort of concept of using that in a diagnostic study. So the similarity between a research study and a diagnostic test. Remember that you have got a 2x2 table. True positive, true negative, false positive, false negative. Here the study results can be positive or negative. But the truth here is the null hypothesis. Here the treatment is better than placebo, or the null hypothesis is not correct. This is true positive. Treatment is better than placebo. Null hypothesis is correct. Then you have these. This is the truth in the underlying research hypothesis. So I'm just trying to convert this same concept into a diagnostic study. Not me, I've taken it from material. So first we'll talk about power. The power of the study is defined as the probability of a positive finding if there is truly a difference. So the power, the study concludes there is a difference when there is truly one. What is that? True positive. Divided by all the study results when there is truly a difference. That is the whole A plus B square, A plus C square, sorry. So true positive divided by true positive plus false negative. So you see, the power is analogous to sensitivity. Mathematically, it works out to close to the, or it is the sensitivity. What is a p-value? The significant p-value, usually 0.05, is the probability of a positive finding if there is truly no difference. An example, this is the, if the null hypothesis is true. So the p-value is the false positive value divided by the false positive plus the true negative. So the study concludes there is a difference when there is no difference. It is false positive. All the results when there is truly no difference, that is B plus D. So this is the inverse of specificity. The 1 minus specificity, or the false positive rate ratio, is the p-value actually. So that is one way of expressing the p-value is 1 minus the specificity, or is analogous. The power is analogous to the sensitivity. Analogous, that's the correct word to use. You can't say equal to, analogous. Now I'm going to give an example which is not really from a diagnostic study, but I would like to use it. Often the FDA uses these kind of data to look at their analysis. Let us say that 10% of an investigational drug in phase 1 trials eventually receive FDA approval. It's a general rule. And we assume that the probability of any new drug is actually better than placebo is 10%. Let us assume that there are 1,000 different drugs undergoing clinical trial. And let us say that each of these 1,000 trials has got 80% power and the p-value is set as 0.05 or the alpha error set at 0.05. What is the probability that a trial with a positive result is false positive? Remember, there are 1,000 trials. Each of them appears to be good, 80% power and p-value 0.05. What is the chance that if you do 1,000 trials, there will be false positive trials? In other words, one of these trials will actually come back showing my new drug works when it actually doesn't work. So we must go back to the same kind of picture like this, which I showed you earlier. There are 1,000 drugs, 1,000 studies with 1,000 drugs, one each. 100 are better than placebo. So it means 900 are no different. Where do we get that? From this. Assume that the probability of any new drug being actually better is 10%. So you must have some general idea about your field. That is 10. So there are 1,000 drugs, 100 are better than placebo, 900 are no different. The power represents the probability of finding a difference if one truly exists. So the power is 80% in all the studies, 80% of 100. So this number here will be 80. If one truly exists, then 80% of drugs that are truly beneficial should have positive trials. So 80 out of 100. The p-value represents the probability of finding a difference when there is truly none. Is the false negative. Sorry, the false positive. Or 1 minus specificity. So here we know that that's been set as 5%. So 5% of these 900 is 45. We'll have a false positive studies, just chance alone. 855 are true negative. So you find that 45 are false positive studies. 80 are true positive studies. So 80, so here you have 80 plus 45, 125. Out of the 125 positive trials, 80 are true positive studies, that is 64. That is, the drug is truly different from placebo. The remaining 45 trials, that is 45 out of 125, 36%. Are false positive due to chance. Now, why did we make you do this complicated thing? The key insight here is that of the studies, 1,000 studies which are submitted to FDA, which looks like they work, 36% are positive due to chance alone. People think that, oh, false positive studies must be 5%. It is not. It's a misguided interpretation of the p-value. It is actually 36%, not 5%. Here we did not use exact p-values. We just use that. Now each study will say a different thing. When they publish a study, they'll say p-value maybe we have set at 0.049 or 0.001. We assume the general value of 0.05. If a particular study has a p-value of 0.001 when they started off for the outcome, then the probability of false positive finding in the study will be lower. That we have to acknowledge. Now, let's look at some more the connection between the Bayes and p-value. What is Bayes? What I told you earlier, the Fagan's nomogram. You have a pretest probability. You marry that information with the current information that you got, which is the sensitivity and specificity, positive, negative value of a test, and you come to a posterior conclusion. You start off with the prior information before you do the test, the pretest probability. Then you do the test. When you marry both of these, you come to a post-test probability. This whole concept is called Bayes. It was initially propounded by one Reverend Thomas Bayes. So now we are going to talk about the connection between Bayes and p-value. So the importance of a baseline prevalence of drugs that are truly different from placebo. Here we said is 10% probability that drugs may work. As the prevalence of a beneficial drug increases, the probability of a false positive finding decreases. So in diagnostic studies, sensitivity and specificity are insufficient. We must incorporate the prevalence of the disease. Similarly, power and p-value are insufficient. We must consider the likelihood that the hypothesized difference is real, and this could be done by reviewing the prior literature. So from our study, we get sensitivity, specificity, which are analogous to power and p-value. But like I've told you now, we must incorporate the pre-test probability, and then you will come to a correct post-test probability, because though sensitivity and specificity may not vary from place to place, the pre-test probability or the prevalence does, and that affects the post-test probability. Now, this I'll start off with what is given on the y-axis. This is the post-study probability of a false positive result. So the post-test probability of false positive could be 0, could be 100%. Going up on this is not very good. This is the pre-test probability of a true difference. So we thought in this pre-test probability was 10%. In the example I gave, so that only 10% of the studies investigational true new drugs are actually good. So using this, we can say that this is how the studies go. So this is a vitamin C in reducing mortality in septic shock. The plausibility of this hypothesis based on prior literature, the biological plausibility can be incorporated. So where do you get this biological plausibility? You must meet a group of experts. Look at the case control studies or cohort studies or other observation data. What is the pre-test probability that is likely to be true? Based on this, we can come to a post-test probability. So the probability of a false positive study, the probability of a positive study result being false positive, that's a vertical axis, depending on the pre-test probability of a true difference, horizontal axis, assuming a power of 80% and a p-value at 0.05 and no significant bias or confounding. I'm going to talk about bias and confounding a little later. So we find that if the pre-test probability of a true difference comes more than 60%, well, there's a 60% chance that I'll find a difference, then the post-test probability is between 0 to 5% of a false positive finding. So this is an important concept to keep in mind when you're looking at study results. Now I'm going to move on to slightly different concept, and this will probably take the remainder of my 20 minutes. Indeterminate results, intermediate results, uninterpretable results, and bias. I know these are different kinds of topics, but these are the tasks given to me. Now, in a 2x2 table, the data has to be positive, negative for the new test and the gold standard. Sometimes you are forcing data into this 2x2 contingency table. So this may be inappropriate. So sometimes, what are you going to do when your new test result is uncertain or indeterminate? In that situation, you may have to have a 2x3 table or even a 2x4 table. So that is what I'm going to talk about in the next 10 minutes. So the gold standard is easy. You have a positive gold standard or a negative gold standard. The index test could be positive or negative. But very often we know that the new test is indeterminate. Let's say ELISA test. If it is bright yellow, it's positive. If it is white, it is negative. If it's light yellow, we don't know how to interpret it. Then there's an indeterminate test. So we must actually publish a 2x3 table like this, or 3x2 contingency table. How do you interpret the results in this? We must do a likelihood ratio, LR positive or negative. The probability of an indeterminate result in the presence of disease divided by the probability of indeterminate result in the absence of disease. So I just go back, the probability of indeterminate result in the presence of disease. So you get this probability divided by the probability here, will give you the likelihood ratio for the indeterminate result. That's how one does this interpretation of a 3 into 2 table. Now, often when you're doing genetic tests, the genetic test is positive by gold standard, positive by the new test. A, B, C, D is very easy. Now, in the genetic test, sometimes you have something called partially correct. What do you mean by partially correct of square E? Category E represents those patients for whom the index test and the reference test both detect a disease, but different number of foci. So in other words, they both said there is disease, but the reference test detected it in some other gene, whereas the index test found out that there is disease in some other gene. So it's partially correct. Both are saying disease, but they're looking at a different foci. Sorry, not different foci, different number of foci. The reference standard said it may be in 5 foci that there are disease, whereas your index test only said picked it up in 3. So this picked it up less than the reference standard, or the other way around. This may have picked up more than this. So this is called a partially correct test. So I apologize for that. So again, partially correct is when the number of foci the reference standard picks up is different from the number of foci that the index has picked up. Just note that difference. What about square F? Here is the foci are different. So the reference standard picks up genes, let us say in chromosome 1, 2, and 3, or in different areas, whereas the index test picks it up in some other chromosome or some other area. So this is an incorrect index test. So once again, this is how you have a 4/2 table. So when you have partially correct or incorrect results, this is how one must actually present your data. So now I have finished covering indeterminate results and incorrect results, how one presents these. But now I'm going to move on to the last part of my topic, which will probably take about 13 minutes. I have about 10 slides on bias. Bias is anything that takes us away from the truth. So bias can occur in diagnostic studies. So variation refers to the variation and results between different diagnostic studies due to variations in the study. So the study has a PICO, patient, intervention, comparison, outcome. So you may have variability in the kinds of patient, in the new test, the gold standard, and the way the outcome is represented. All these are variability. So I'm going to talk for the next 13 minutes about bias in diagnostic studies. Now, some of you may have switched off. It's been a long class. So you must look at this particular guideline then. I'll leave this guideline with you. You can go back and check in this particular website called Equator Network. A well-planned study is, and you can look at this guideline called STAR-D. And there's another one called QUADAS, Risk of Bias in Diagnostic Studies. If you're comparing QUADAS 2, that is, if you're comparing two diagnostic studies, there's something called QUADAS C. Both of these are almost the same, and they're available in this Equator Network. They talk about biases also. So when you're planning a good diagnostic study, you use the STAR-D checklist. So please, all of you, when somebody comes to you and says, so you're the statistician, please help me to design a good study, please direct them to Equator Network and STAR-D or QUADAS. So let us look at QUADAS 2. So the QUADAS 2 has various different domains. Domains are patient selection, the index test, the reference standard, flow and timing. And under each domain, there are different headings. So description, so patient selection, how was the patient selected? Description of index test, have they described the index test properly? Have they described the reference standard? Flow and timing. Describe any patient who did not receive index test or reference standard. In other words, the 2/2 table may not be actually correct. There may be some people who did the index test who didn't have gold standard. Some people who had gold standard who didn't have index test. So, was there a signaling question? So, the very important signaling question, yes or no. Was it a consecutive sample? Remember, I said a good diagnostic test must be prospective and consecutive, meaning everybody who's potentially eligible should be included in the study. That's consecutive. Have they avoided case control studies? So here a yes or no. So based on this, you can make a risk of bias high or low. So for each of patient selection bias, index test bias, reference standard bias, and here's the flow. Based on the flow, could there have been a bias? So the bias could be high, low, or unclear, and the quadas gives you a sort of guideline how to write high, low, or intermediate risk of bias. I'm going to talk about each of these biases in a little more detail over the next 9 minutes. So the source of bias in a diagnostic study, I've given you this reference here. It could be the demography. The study was done in America in a very rich, affluent neighborhood, and you are going to use the study in a group of villagers who are very poor, with very different background situation. So that is a variation bias because you're using the study in another population. You may use it in the study might have been done in a tertiary care center wherever you are in Calcutta or Chennai or Bangalore with most of the people having severe disease. That's why the study was described. But you are sitting in a primary healthcare center, and there you may have people with less severe disease. So there's a bias due to variation. Prevalence. I've explained to you the concept of Bayes. So you know that if you do in a situation with a high prevalence, then the positive predictive value, negative predictive value look very good. Whereas if you do the study in an area of low prevalence, then you will have different results. This is also a variation bias due to disease prevalence. Participant selection. Some people might have taken cases with disease and controls without disease. Somebody else might have done a correct study, all people with suspected disease, prospectively recruited and consecutively recruited. So there may be a difference in the way studies are done. This is a participant selection bias, again a variation bias. So execution. Now, the diagnostic study should clearly describe how the index test and the diagnostic gold standard test were done. Now, one person may have great expertise and do both properly. In some other situation, either the index test or the gold standard is not done so well. Again, you'll have variation. This is also a variation bias of test execution. Now, let us say the PCR is done 5 years ago. Even let us say the test for RT-PCR for TB was developed 10 years ago. Maybe India is using the generation 1 PCR test. But over 10 years now, the PCR test has become better by itself. So that's a technological development. So now that we may not get the same result as somebody got 10 years ago using the older method. So there is a problem with the same gold standard, but that itself has technically improved. Now that's something called a treatment paradox. Let us say the index test is done today, but the gold standard test is done only 1 week later. In between the index test being done and the gold standard test being done, the patient has some treatment. The treatment may alter the patient's condition, and therefore the gold standard test or the index test, if it is done in a reverse manner, that will change. So this is called a treatment paradox in a diagnostic study. Very similarly, let us say the index test is done today and the gold standard is done a 1 week later. No treatment is given, but the patient starts getting better by himself, or the patient gets worse by himself, and then the gold standard is done a week later, then some problem will occur. This is called disease progression bias. It's another kind of bias. Now, I didn't talk about this prior in diagnostic studies, the role of blinding. The person who does the index test should not know the result of the gold standard test. If they know that, then they may change it. They may say that, oh my goodness, my index test came negative, but the gold standard is positive. Let me do my index test again, or vice versa. So this is the effect of blinding. So an ideal test, the person doing the index test should not know the gold standard test. Now, if you're a small hospital, a postgraduate student doing, or a small faculty, a faculty who's doing both in a lab, they don't have the luxury of two different people doing it. They can do some sort of blinding by giving some dummy numbers. So they won't be able to go back immediately and check the result of the index test or the gold standard test. So this is a bias of blinding. Now, clinical review bias. The person doing the index test is not given the clinical features. He's just told, here's a test, blood sample to the test. Whereas the person doing the gold standard is given the clinical features, or this is the clinical background of the patient. So again, this introduces a sort of bias. Incorporation bias. Now, very often, the new test is part of a gold standard. Let us say you are trying to diagnose tuberculosis, and the new test is a sputum gene expert. But the gold standard also includes gene expert being positive. So this is called an incorporation bias. So the last one is called observer bias, and this has to do with reproducibility or the reliability. The same test done by the same person 2-3 times may vary intra-observer variability, or the same test done by two different observers may vary between them intra-observer variability or reliability issues. So diagnostic study can also be plagued by reliability issues. So how do you handle bias? Uninterpretable results. So diagnostic tests fail when you don't talk about uninterpretable results. So what people commonly do is they just take it out of both the gold standard and the new test. They'll take out that patient sample totally. So it appears that there is no uninterpretable result. This leads to bias. So again, there's bias because you interpreted the results wrongly. You know, most people know, most journals will not like to have a 3x2 table. And they'll say, oh, what nonsense, how did you have uninterpretable? Everybody knows that almost all diagnostic studies have uninterpretable results, but they're not very happy when you publish it. So this introduces bias. The second bias, which we'll talk about tomorrow, when we're doing ROC curve, is you make an arbitrary cutoff. Above creatinine value of 2 is renal failure, below 2 is not renal failure. So this kind of an arbitrary cutoff also introduces a bias. It may exaggerate the sensitivity and specificity of one test, or it may make another test look bad. So this arbitrary thresholds which one produces, which we'll talk about tomorrow, also introduces bias. The last two bias, one is called verification or workup bias, which I need to talk about, is when, remember that I told you the flow chart, everybody who has a new test must have the gold standard. Now let us assume that the gold standard is very costly. So then one fellow will say, I'm just using words colloquially, you know, if the new test is positive, I'll do the gold standard. If the new test is negative, I don't have the money to do all the gold standard on all the negative people. I'll do it only on some of them. So this is called partial verification bias. Or after some time, the gold standard is not available anymore. So you have to come up with a new gold standard. So some people have gold standard A, some other patients have got gold standard B. This is called differential verification. I know I'm almost out of time, but please bear with me for 5 more minutes and I'll try to finish it. Dr. J, is it okay if I go on for 5 more minutes?
Yes, please.
Okay. I apologize to the members. Partial verification bias. Here you have the group of patients who have the test. The index test is done. And then the reference standard should be done. Now I remember what I told you. The index test is positive. Here they do the reference test for everybody. But when the index test is negative, now they say, look, I don't have the money to do the gold standard for everybody. So they do only some people the gold standard test. Reference standard is not done on everybody whom the index test is negative. So the risks of low numbers here and the risk of false negative becoming low. So there's a particular problem. This test will artificially look like the true positive number is high because you didn't do the test on everybody. the false negative number may be falsely low. This is the problem with the partial verification bias. Differential verification bias. Let us say that there is a study called D-dimer for doing a DVT. Patients who had a positive D-dimer result were assessed by ultrasonography. Now, this is the reference standard one. But people who are negative by the D-dimer, that the PI thought, why should I do a ultrasonography? That's very costly. I won't do ultrasound. I'll just tell them, you go home. If you have any problem, you call me up after 3 months. That becomes a reference standard 2. Therefore, patients who had a DVT but negative D-dimer result may not have been diagnosed by this method. There may be somebody who had a DVT actually, but the D-dimer was negative. They didn't have the ultrasound, they would have been missed. So this differential verification overestimates the sensitivity of the new test. So here differential verification, this people with suspected DVT, index test was D-dimer. When the D-dimer was positive, everybody had the ultrasound. But when the D-dimer was negative, they didn't do the gold standard Doppler. They just sent them home and told, please go home and call me if you have any problem. So artificially, the sensitivity will become inflated. So the impact of differential verification is sometimes less clear-cut. The impact of differential verification depends on the diagnostic accuracy of the two reference standards. So it depends on how good the ultrasound was as compared to just telling the patient to go home and follow up. If going home and following up is just as good as ultrasound, then it's fine. But if it's not, then the sensitivity will vary. So remember, differential verification is difficult to interpret. It depends on the accuracy of the two different gold standards which have been used relative to each other, because both have been used compared to one against each other gold standard, how relatively they work, then the differential verification bias comes. How do you correct for verification bias? Correction for verification bias, you attempt to reclassify people based on their actual outcome. So you try to reclassify patients who are tested negative into false negative category to account for the number of false negative missed due to verification bias. So you have to make some sort of guesstimate. You have to make a sort of one guesstimate. Let us say there were actually supposed to be 1,000 people here, but only 500 people the gold standard was done. Other 500 we don't know. You have to make some sort of guesstimate what would be the true number of false negatives here. That can be done by Bayesian technique or some empiric probability of verification, and is calculated, and then you can make a sort of adjustment for that. So you have to make some sort of a guesstimate and make an estimation. The last one, I absolutely apologize. This is a spectrum bias. I've talked about it already, but I wanted to speak about it a little. The sensitivity and specificity of a test can be affected by the spectrum of patients. So in primary care, people will usually have mild disease. Generally, when you come to the hospital, people with cancer tend to have more advanced disease. Emergency may be in between. So there's a different mix of patients. So an example would be the diagnostic accuracy of a new test, let's say ACPA test, rheumatoid arthritis, varies. In case control studies, we take people with severe disease and call them cases. And people without disease at all are called controls. This overestimates the sensitivity of a test. Whereas if you take somebody in a primary health care, anybody walking in with joint pain, there's a very low prior probability of having rheumatoid arthritis. And the same sensitivity specificity can't be expected there. This is called spectrum bias. So the impact of spectrum bias varies. It's a usual largest overestimation happens when you have severe cases and healthy controls, which is what happens usually in diagnostic studies. And most diagnostic studies are published are called case control studies. So the relative diagnostic odds ratio is 4.9 if you compare it with the prospective study of suspected cases. Severe cases are easier to detect and therefore increasing the sensitivity, while healthy controls are easy to rule out overestimating specificity. Studies that do not include patients consecutively are overestimating the diagnostic odds ratio by 50% compared to that which use consecutive series. So I do apologize for going far over time, and I didn't leave too much time for questions. However, I am happy to stay back and answer some questions if you have the patience. So I'll hand over to Jay sir to take however many questions I have time for.
Tambo, I have one question.
Yes, sir.
Do you remember the 4/2 table?
Yes, sir.
The last two categories did not have any observation on the other side. This is negative.
Yes, sir.
Should we put, when you want to calculate this one, negative side, there's no observation.
If there are, in this example which this person has made the table from, there are no observations. Then we can't calculate a likelihood ratio.
Yeah.
But there may be observations, in which
Okay.
case we can calculate likelihood ratio.
Okay, correct. That is. Any questions?
Hello, sir.
Yes, yes.
Sir, in the diagnostic odds ratio test, can you please repeat the range of the diagnostic odds ratio test? I think some confusion in my end.
Diagnostic odds ratios, more than one are useful. It's like odds ratio. Diagnostic odds ratio of one means no use. The test cannot differentiate between people with disease and without disease. Values which go higher and higher, like I've shown you this picture here, 100, 200, 300, means it's very good in differentiating disease positive, negative. Diagnostic odds ratios less than one means some problem with the result. That means more negative people have more disease. So that means you have done some problem with the coding of who is disease and not disease. So there's some improper interpretation of the coding of your disease in the database.
Sir, actually, just my confusion is the range is 0 to 1. And
no, it's not 0 to 1, 0 to infinity.
No, infinity.
Okay, 0 to infinity. Okay. Sorry, sir. Okay.
Odds ratio ranges. Odds ratio ranges 0 to infinity. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, sir. Just my confusion.
No.
Any other questions?
No, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thanks, Tambo. We'll wind up here.
All right.
See you tomorrow.
So we'll meet tomorrow for ROC curve.
Yes.
Thank you all for patiently listening. Apologies for going over time, sir.
No problem.
All right, sir. All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.